She set the pistol down on the chopping block and stepped into the middle of the dooryard with 3 rifles at her back and 3 killers in front of her. "I will go with you," she said. The eldest brother dropped his sharps an inch. He had not spoken aloud to a woman in 5 years, not since he had buried his wife behind that cabin and sworn an oath to the mountain wind that he would never love again. But the woman walking out to meet those killers had whispered his dead wife's name into his coat the night he carried her up off the snow, and now she was about to give herself up to save him. Friend, before we go any further, let me take you back to the beginning, to a row house in Boston 6 weeks before that bitter wind on Blackwood Ridge, where a young woman buried her father and answered a letter from a man who did not exist. The leather of her boots had gone hard as iron. Adelaide Whitcomb could no longer feel her toes, and she had stopped trying an hour ago. The wind on Blackwood Ridge did not howl the way wind howled in books. It screamed. It tore at her wool traveling cloak like something living, something hungry, something that had been waiting up here in the Bitterroot Mountains a long time for a girl foolish enough to walk into its mouth. Ahead of her, the snow fell sideways across a stone outcrop that the locals called Eagle's Point. She could not see the drop. She did not need to. She could feel the absence of ground the way a person feels the absence of a tooth, that cold, empty place where something solid should be. One more step, maybe two, then the long fall into nothing, the wind catching her petticoats like a sail, and the long quiet after. Behind her, somewhere in the black tangle of cedar and lodgepole pine, a wolf began to sing. It was not the lonely cry of a single animal calling for company. It was a hunting call, low and patient, and it was answered almost at once by another voice farther up the slope, then a third closer than the others. Della pressed her gloved hand against the cameo brooch pinned at her throat. The brooch had belonged to her grandmother, Eleanor Ashford. The name was engraved on the gold backing in a flowing script she had traced with her finger 1,000 times as a child. It was the only thing in this whole frozen world that still belonged to her. She did not know that 3 men were watching her through a brass spyglass from a cabin 300 yards above the ridge. She did not know that one of those men had stood 5 years ago at a grave behind that same cabin and sworn an oath to the mountain wind that he would never again risk his heart on a woman, never again break a promise, never again carry another soul through the snow. She did not know that he was the only thing standing between her and the long fall. Not yet. Friend, before we go any further into this story, let me ask you something. If you are listening to me right now, somewhere out there in this great country of ours, in a workshop or a kitchen or a porch in the cool of the evening, would you do me the kindness of letting me know where you are tonight? Drop a comment below and tell me. Texas, Tennessee, Montana, Maine. I read every one of them, and there is something fine about knowing the same story is being heard by a man in Wyoming and a man in West Virginia at the same hour. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. I tell a new frontier tale every week, true to the old ways, true to the old code. The kind of story your grandfather might have told you on the porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand. Now let us go back 6 weeks before that bitter wind on Blackwood Ridge, all the way back to a row house in Boston where a young woman buried her father. The Reverend Josiah Whitcomb had preached for 40 years at a small congregational church on the north end of Beacon Street. He had married Adelaide's mother in 1854 and lost her to the consumption in 1873. When Adelaide was 17 years old. The girl had nursed her mother through that long final winter, and when the doctor came down the stairs shaking his head and folding away his stethoscope, it was Adelaide who washed her mother's body and combed her mother's hair and laid her in the pine box her father had ordered from the carpenter on the corner. She had wept once quietly in the pantry where no one could see her. Then she had wiped her face with the back of her hand and gone back to work. The same disease that took her mother began to gnaw at her father 2 winters later. It worked slowly at first, a cough in the morning, a handkerchief tucked away, then a slow weakening, a bending of the shoulders, a thinness of the wrists. By the autumn of 1879, he was bedridden, and Adelaide was 23 years old, and she had spent 6 years of her young life carrying water and broth and clean linens up and down a narrow staircase in a row house that smelled of camphor and lavender and something else underneath, something that no amount of soap could scrub away. The smell of a long sickness, the smell of a house preparing to be empty. He went on a Tuesday in October. She held his hand. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said, "My darling girl, my Della, my brave, brave girl." He said, "The Lord will send you a path." And then he closed his eyes and did not open them again. The funeral was on Friday. By Saturday, the creditors had come. The doctor's bills had not been paid in 11 months. The pharmacy on the corner was owed $47.16 for laudanum and bitter tonics that had not in the end saved anyone. The house itself belonged to the church, And on Monday morning, a man in a dark coat with a gold watch chain came up the steps and explained with great kindness and a kind of bureaucratic regret that the parsonage would be needed for the new minister within the fortnight. She sat at her father's writing desk that night with a single candle burning, and she added up what she had: a trunk, a change of dresses, her mother's wedding band, which she would not sell, the cameo brooch with her grandmother's name on it, which she would not sell either, $12.40 in coin, a King James Bible with her father's notes in the margins, and no place to go. Two doors opened to her in those last cold days in Boston. The first was a position offered by a Mr. Hollis Pemberton of Beacon Hill, who had come to the funeral and stood too close and pressed his card into her hand and said his daughters needed a governess and that he would pay handsomely. She had felt his eyes on her as the casket was carried out of the church. She had felt his eyes on her again when he stood on the steps of the parsonage 3 days later and asked very gently whether she had given any further thought to his offer. There was a way a man looked at a young woman alone in the world, and she had seen that look in his eyes, and she had known the way a sparrow knows the shadow of a hawk, that the position would not stay confined to the schoolroom for long. The second door was a folded newspaper that her father's sister Margaret had sent her from Vermont, with a single advertisement circled in pencil, the Matrimonial News it was called. A respectable paper, her aunt had written in the margin, used by good families when distance and circumstance prevented a proper courtship. The advertisement read as follows: Christian gentleman, age 34, hardware merchant of Helena, Montana Territory, seeks a virtuous wife of good character and sound mind, no drinker, no widower, will provide rail fare. Address replies to Mr. Marcus Reed, General Delivery, Helena. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday and posted it on a Wednesday. The reply came 11 days later in a heavy envelope that contained a railway ticket, a bank draft for $20, and a short note in a tight, slanting hand. Miss Whitcomb, your letter pleased me greatly. The enclosed will see you to Helena. A wagon train departs from there north and west, and I will arrange to meet you at the journey's end. Yours in expectation, Marcus Reed. She read the letter 3 times. She thought of Mr. Pemberton's eyes on the parsonage steps. She thought of her father's promise that a path would open. She folded the letter into her Bible at the page of the 23rd Psalm, and she packed her trunk that very night. She did not know that there was no Marcus Reed. She did not know that the post office box in Helena was rented by a man named Jedediah Crane, who was the nephew of a wagon master named Cole Briggs, and that Jed Crane had used that box and that false name 3 times before to lure unattached women west out of the cities of the East. She did not know that he had a particular taste for the daughters of dead clergyman women he believed would be too frightened and too friendless to make a fuss. She did not know any of it. She knew only that she had a ticket and a destination and a verse from the 23rd Psalm folded into her father's Bible, and that was enough to carry her aboard the train that left South Station on the 2nd of November in the year of our Lord, 1879. The train ran for 6 days. She sat in the second-class car with her trunk under her feet and her Bible in her lap, and she watched the country open up beyond the window like a great rolling promise. Pennsylvania farmland, the long brown plains of Ohio, the Mississippi at sunset, wide and slow and the color of beaten copper. By the time the train rolled into Helena, she had not slept a full night in a week, and her hands trembled when she stepped down onto the platform and looked for a man in a brown coat with a sprig of pine in his hatband, the way Marcus Reed had said in his letter he would be dressed. There was no man in a brown coat. There was no sprig of pine. There was only a hard wind blowing down off the mountains and a wagon train forming up at the edge of town with mules already in their traces and a tall, thin man with a pearl-handled revolver on his hip who walked up to her and tipped his hat and said, Miss Whitcomb, I am afraid Mr. Reed has been delayed at his shop. He has asked me to escort you up to his homestead with the wagon train. The name is Crane, Jedediah Crane, at your service. She should have known then. She told herself afterwards many times that she should have known. Something in his eyes did not match the smoothness of his voice the way a tin pan does not match a silver spoon when struck. But she was tired and frightened and 1,000 miles from anything she understood, and she let him take her trunk, and she climbed up onto the buckboard of the third wagon in the train, and the wheels began to turn. The wagon train rolled north and west out of Helena into a country that grew wilder with every mile. The road was a road only by courtesy. It was 2 ruts in the earth and the memory of other wheels. By the 3rd day, the women of the train had begun to know one another, and Della found herself drawn to a young widow named Cordelia Pike, who rode with her 2 small children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4. Cordelia had buried her husband in Ohio the spring before, and she was traveling west to a brother in Oregon Territory who had sent for her. She had a quiet, steady way about her, and she watched things, and on the 4th night out of Helena, she set her tin cup down beside the cook fire and looked across at Della and said, Child, I do not like the way that Crane fellow looks at you. I have seen rabbits looked at that way, and the rabbits did not last the night. You watch yourself. Della felt a coldness at her throat that had nothing to do with the November wind. She had felt Jed Crane's eyes on her, too. She had told herself it was only that he was the one who knew her business, that he was being attentive on Mr. Reed's behalf. But Cordelia's words gave shape to what she had already feared, and that night she lay under her wool blanket and watched the firelight move on the canvas of the wagon top and prayed for daylight. The next afternoon at the noon halt, Cordelia Pike walked over to Della's wagon under the pretense of borrowing a needle, and she pressed a folded newspaper into Della's hand under the cover of her shawl. "Read it tonight," she whispered. "Burn it after." Della tucked the paper into the front of her dress and felt it lying there like a small hot stone all afternoon. When the camp was asleep that night, she crept out with a candle stub and read the paper by the dying light of the cook fire. It was a back issue of the Matrimonial News, and Cordelia had marked it with a piece of charcoal. There was no advertisement from a Marcus Reed of Helena. There never had been. The advertisement, Della had answered, did not exist anywhere in the paper's records because the paper kept records of every advertisement it ran, and Cordelia, who had once worked in a print shop in Cleveland, had known how to ask. The whole letter had been a lie. The bank draft had been a lure. The ticket had been a hook. Della sat by the dying fire and felt something in her chest go very still, the way a clock goes still when the spring breaks. She did not weep. She had wept herself dry by her father's bed, and she had no tears left for a stranger's lie. But she felt the cold of the prairie reach up into her bones, and she understood for the first time how alone she truly was. She rose at dawn and walked over to where Jed Crane was saddling his bay horse. The other men were a ways off gathering the mules. She stood with her hands folded in front of her the way her father had taught her to stand when she was about to say a thing that needed saying. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice quiet and very level, "I should like to speak with Mr. Reed myself by letter, if you would be so kind as to give me the address of his hardware store in Helena." He turned slowly. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. "There is no need for that, Miss Whitcomb," he said. "We will be at his place in another 4 days. I should still like the address," she said. He set down the saddle and looked at her, and the smile he had been wearing slid off his face, and what was underneath was not the face of a hardware merchant's friend. It was the face of a man who had been told no by a woman and did not intend to hear it twice. "You are out here in the middle of nowhere, sweetheart," he said, softly, so softly that the words barely reached her ears. "There is no Marcus Reed. There is only me. You will marry me at the end of this trail, or you will not marry anyone. But either way, you are not going home because there is no home for you to go to. You read me." She did not answer. She turned and walked back to her wagon with her chin lifted and her hands shaking inside her cloak, and she did not let him see her shake. She climbed up on the seat. She picked up her Bible. She opened it to the 23rd Psalm. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she read, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." She read the words 3 times until her hands stopped trembling. Then she closed the book and waited for whatever came next. What came next came at first light the following morning. The shout went up across the camp before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. "My watch, my silver watch, my grandfather's watch, it has been taken in the night." The voice belonged to Jed Crane, and it was loud, theatrical, the voice of a man who wanted very much to be heard. She knew, before she even climbed down from her wagon, what was about to happen. She knew it the way a person knows a storm by the smell of the air. They came for her trunk. Cole Briggs, the wagon master, a thick, gray-bearded man with a face like weathered leather, walked up to her wagon with Jed Crane at his shoulder and said, "Miss Whitcomb, with all respect, my nephew has lost a valuable possession, and he claims to have seen it last night near your wagon. I will have to ask you to open your trunk." She opened it. There were eyes on her from every wagon in the train. Cordelia Pike stood at the edge of the crowd with one hand pressed to her mouth. The pocket watch was nestled in the folds of her best Sunday dress, gleaming silver against the dark wool. Cole Briggs picked it up between 2 fingers and held it to the light. "There it is," said Jed Crane behind him, and his voice had a tremble of false outrage that anyone with ears could have heard. "There is the watch my granddaddy carried at Bull Run, hidden in the dress of a thief." "I did not take that watch," Della said. Her voice was clear. She was surprised by how clear it was. "Mr. Crane placed it there himself last night because I refused his attentions. There is no Marcus Reed. The man whose name brought me here does not exist." Jed Crane laughed. It was a thin, ugly laugh. Cole Briggs looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the watch. He looked at the silent crowd of his wagon train. He was not a cruel man, Briggs, but he was a tired one, and he did not want to spend the rest of the morning sorting out she said between his only nephew and a Boston girl he had never met before this trip. He sighed, and he handed the watch back to Jed Crane, and he turned to Della. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I cannot have a thief on this train. I will not have my men whip a young woman, neither, so I will give you a kindness. You will take your blanket and your canteen and your Bible, and you will walk. You will go back the way we came. Helena is 4 days' ride. You may make it. You may not. That is no longer my concern, but you will go now, and you will go alone." She did not argue. There was no argument left to make. She climbed back into her wagon and gathered her wool blanket and her canteen and her father's Bible and the cameo brooch with her grandmother's name on it, and she stepped down into the dust of the trail with the eyes of 40 strangers on her back. Cordelia Pike walked over and held her by the elbows for a single long moment, and as she did, she pressed something into Della's hand under the cover of her shawl, a folded scrap of paper. "If it goes hard," Cordelia whispered, "do not go back to Helena. Go north. There are 3 brothers up on Blackwood Ridge. They do not welcome strangers, but they are good men. The youngest of them rode past my wagon 2 springs ago when our axle broke, and he fixed it and would not take a coin. The name is Hollister. They are the only Christian thing on that mountain. Do you hear me, child? North, not back to Helena. Go north." Della closed her hand around the paper. She nodded once, and then the wagons were turning and the wheels were creaking, and she was standing alone on 1,000 miles of prairie, watching the only world she'd go on without her. She walked. She walked for the rest of that day, and she made a small fire that night in the lee of a fallen cottonwood, and she ate a piece of hardtack and read the 23rd Psalm by the light of the flames. She did not weep. She thought she would weep, but she did not. She thought of her father's last words to her. She thought, "The path you spoke of has men like Jedediah Crane on it, Father, and I do not understand." But she did not say it aloud. She closed the book and lay down on her side with her cloak wrapped tight around her, and she slept the thin, watchful sleep of the hunted. In the morning, she did not turn south toward Helena. She turned north. She unfolded Cordelia's scrap of paper in the gray light and read what was written there in a careful schoolmistress's hand. "Blackwood Ridge, Hollister Brothers. Look for the smoke at sunrise. They will not come to you. You must go to them." She walked north through that day and the next. She left the prairie behind, and the land began to rise. She climbed into foothills, then into the lower slopes of pine and spruce. The wind grew sharper. Her boots, which had been thin Boston walking boots, began to give way at the seams. Her hands gloved in their thin lambskin lost feeling in the fingertips and did not get it back. She drank from a stream once, and the water was so cold it made her teeth ache for an hour. On the 3rd night, the snow came. It came not as the gentle snow of a Boston Christmas card, but as the snow of the high country, the snow that rides on a wind out of the north and that does not stop falling until it has buried the world. By the morning of the 4th day, she was wading through drifts to her knees, and she had lost the trail, and she had lost the sun, and she had begun to hear her father's voice clearly, as though he were walking just behind her, reciting the 23rd Psalm in his calm pulpit voice. By the afternoon of the 4th day, she was no longer walking. She was stumbling. Her vision had narrowed to a pale tunnel. She no longer felt cold. That was the worst sign. She knew it was the worst sign. She had read it in a missionary's book once, that when the cold stopped being cold and became warm, you were closer to the end than you knew. She reached a flat stone outcrop where the wind had scoured the snow nearly bare, and she saw a great drop ahead of her into a gray nothing where a valley should be, Eagle's Point. Though she did not know its name, she took one step forward and then another, and her legs went out from under her, and she fell forward onto her hands and knees in the snow. She thought, "I cannot go any farther." She thought, "Lord, if this is the path, I am at the end of it." She closed her eyes. She felt the warmth coming up from the snow. She thought of her father's hand in hers on his last day, and of her mother singing in the kitchen long ago, and of a row house in Boston where the lavender used to grow in the window box. She thought Eleanor. The name on her grandmother's brooch. She did not know why she thought it. She only knew the name was there in her mind, the way a candle is there in a dark window, small and steady and waiting. And then the singing began behind her. It began in the timber to her left, a long, low howl that lifted and fell and was answered at once by a voice farther up the slope, and then by a third voice closer than the others, and a fourth. She lifted her head. She saw at the edge of the timber a shape moving in the gray, then another, then a third, yellow eyes catching what light there was, long, lean bodies, the color of smoke and slate. She did not have the strength to stand. She did not have the strength to scream. She reached one hand inside her cloak and closed her fingers around the cameo brooch with her grandmother's name on it, and she said the only thing she had left to say. "Lord," she whispered, "if you take me clean." The first wolf began to move. It came out of the trees in that low gliding walk that wolves use when they have decided. The other shapes flanked it. They were perhaps 100 feet away across the open snow. That was when the rifle spoke. The shot came from somewhere above her, somewhere up the slope, a single deep crack that rolled across the ridge like thunder, broken into one sharp piece. The lead wolf went down. Just like that, a shape running and then a shape not running, the body skidding in the snow, the other wolves stopping, ears coming up, heads turning. The second shot came a heartbeat after the first. A second wolf went down. The remaining shapes broke and ran low to the ground, vanishing back into the timber the way smoke vanishes when a door is closed. Della tried to lift her head higher. She could not. She heard very faintly the sound of boots on snow. 3 sets of boots, heavy boots, coming down toward her. She heard a man's voice, low and quick. She is alive. Get the buffalo robe. Move. She heard another voice answer, sharper, younger, edged with something like anger. Anger at her, perhaps, for being there. Anger at the world for putting her there. She did not know. And then there was a third presence, very close, kneeling beside her in the snow, and she felt through the dark of her closing vision an enormous gloved hand pass, once in front of her face, and then under her shoulders, and then under her knees, and she was being lifted as though she weighed nothing. She was being lifted by arms that felt like the bough of an oak tree, broad and steady and warm, even through the wool of her cloak. She forced her eyes open one last time. She looked up. She saw a man's face above her, a face framed by a wide-brim hat dusted with snow, a dark beard streaked with iron gray, eyes the color of a coming storm, blue and black and gray all at once, eyes that had seen a great deal of grief and had learned to carry it without complaint, eyes that were in this moment looking down at her with a stillness that was almost frightening, the way a man looks at a ghost when the ghost has come back wearing a face he used to love. Her lips moved. She did not mean to speak. She did not even know what she was saying. The name was simply there in her mind, the name from the brooch at her throat, and it came out of her on the last thread of breath she had. Eleanor, she whispered. The man holding her stopped walking. She felt him stop. She felt the great body of him go very still, the way a tree goes still in the moment before lightning strikes it. She heard the younger man's voice somewhere behind him, sharp and confused. Silas, did you hear that? Silas, did she just say? She did not hear the rest. The dark closed over her then, and she went down into it the way a stone goes down into deep water, and she heard nothing more. High on the ridge, in a small clearing surrounded by pines so old they had been seedlings when General Washington crossed the Delaware, 3 men stood in the snow with a half-frozen woman in the eldest brother's arms. Silas Hollister was 40 years old. He stood 6 feet 5 inches in his stocking feet, and his shoulders had been built by 25 years of swinging axes and lifting wagon tongues and breaking sod that no plow had ever turned before. His beard was dark and short and streaked with the early gray of a man who had grieved before his time. He had not spoken aloud except in the necessary way of a man giving a one-word command in 5 years. He had been married once. Her name had been Eleanor Ashford of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he had loved her the way a man loves the first true thing he has ever found. He had married her in Cheyenne in the spring of 1873, and he had built her a fine house on 1,000 acres in Wyoming, and they had been happy for 1 year. In the winter of 1874, he had ridden out to check the cattle in a storm that should not have been as bad as it became, and he had been pinned in a line shack for 3 days while the snow piled up to the windows. He had ridden home on the 4th day and found the fire cold and his wife dead in the bed of a sickness she had not been able to fight off alone. He had not said another voluntary word for 5 years except to his brothers, and even to them he spoke rarely. The last thing he had ever said to Eleanor had been, "I will be back by sundown." He had not been back by sundown. He had broken that promise, and the breaking of it had killed her, and he had decided that a man who broke that kind of promise had no business going on talking. Words had failed him. He would not use them anymore. He would speak with his hands and his rifle and the work he did, and he would let that be his speaking, and he would let the silence between him and the world be his penance. Behind him stood his brother Ezra. Ezra was 36, 4 years younger than Silas. He had been a deputy under Sheriff Nathan Hawkins in Cheyenne from 1869 to 1874. He had quit the badge after a bad afternoon in an alley in which a 16-year-old boy with a stolen pistol had drawn on him, and Ezra had been faster, and the boy had died on the cobblestones, and Ezra had spent the rest of that night sitting in the dust beside the body until the sun came up, and he had walked into the sheriff's office the next morning and laid his star on the desk and walked out into the world. He had a quiet way and a kind way, and he carved birds out of cedar in the evenings, and he played a harmonica when the mood was on him, and he was the only one of the 3 brothers who could sometimes coax Silas into the rough thing that passed in their cabin for a smile. Behind Ezra stood the youngest Wyatt. Wyatt was 32. He had auburn hair too long for any town to like and a temper too quick for any town to hold. He was the best shot of the 3 of them. and the worst tempered and the most loyal, and he wore a Bowie knife on his belt the size of a small sword, and he had never been seen without it since he was 14 years old. He had been the one who put the rifle on the lead wolf, and his face was hard now, watching his brother stand in the snow with a woman in his arms. Silas, Wyatt said again. His voice cut through the wind. Did she just say? Silas did not answer. Silas was looking down at the woman in his arms. He had stopped walking, and he could not for a moment remember how to start again. The woman had hair the color of dark honey, and her face was the white of milk, and her lashes were rimmed with frost, and she had spoken a name as she went under into the dark. Eleanor. His wife's name, the name he had not allowed any man on this mountain to speak aloud in 5 years, the name he carved on a stone behind the cabin and brought a single dried alpine flower to on the first day of every month, the name no living soul up on this ridge should have known. He looked at the throat of the woman in his arms. There was a brooch pinned there, a small oval of gold. He could see in the gray light an engraving on the back of it a single word in flowing script, but he could not from this angle read what the word was. Ezra came up beside him. Ezra had heard her too. Silas, Ezra said quietly, "Are you all right?" Silas did not answer. He set his jaw, and he looked away from the woman's face, and he looked up the mountain toward home. The storm was building behind them now. The wind was beginning to scream the way it had screamed the day Eleanor died. He felt that scream in the marrow of his bones, the way an old wound feels the change of weather. He had stood at her grave behind the cabin 5 years ago, and he had sworn with the wind in his teeth and the snow in his beard that he would never carry another woman through this snow, that he would never love again, that he would never break another promise because he had no more promises in him to break. He looked down at the woman in his arms. He felt the small lift and fall of her breathing against his chest, faint and quick as the wing of a sparrow. Her face was turned in toward his coat. Her lashes did not move. She did not know who was carrying her or where she was going or whether she would live to see another sunrise. She had given her life over into the hands of strangers, and she had said the name of his dead wife as she did it, and Silas Hollister did not know whether what he was feeling in that moment was grief or fear or something else, something he had buried so long ago that he had forgotten what it tasted like. "Take her," he said to Ezra. His voice came out of him rough as a saw blade, the first word he had spoken aloud that day. "Take her up. Wyatt, watch the timber. Those wolves will circle." He bent and lifted her higher against his chest, and he turned and he began to climb the slope toward the cabin with the snow whipping past his shoulders, and the woman who had spoken his dead wife's name held tight against the warmth of his coat. Behind them, the wind on Blackwood Ridge began to howl in earnest, and the first true storm of the winter of 1879 came down off the peaks like a judgment, and a girl who had answered a letter from a man who did not exist was carried through the snow into a cabin where 300 miles from any road that could carry her home, the rest of her life was waiting to begin. She did not know it yet. None of them did. Not Silas, who had not said a true sentence to a woman in 5 years. Not Ezra, who would soon be the one to tell her what kind of house she had been carried into. Not Wyatt, who watched the timberline behind them with his hand near his pistol and his jaw set against the cold. Not the woman in the eldest brother's arms, whose lips still held the shape of a name she had whispered without knowing why. The cabin door opened ahead of them in the storm. The fire was burning, the kettle was on, and the long winter that would change all of their lives forever was just beginning to fall. She came up out of the dark, slowly the way a swimmer rises through deep water. The first thing she knew was warmth, not the false warmth of the snow that had been pulling her down, but a real warmth, a deep warmth, the kind that came from a fire built by a man who knew how to build a fire and had been building one in the same hearth for many years. The second thing she knew was the smell of cedar smoke and hide and coffee. The third was the weight of buffalo robes piled across her body, heavy as a winter sky. The fourth was the sound of a chair creaking somewhere across the room, slow and steady, the sound of a man sitting and watching and not speaking. Adelaide Whitcomb opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was made of hand-hewn beams the color of dark honey. The light came from the fireplace and from a single oil lamp set on a shelf beside the bed and from a small square window across the room where the gray of the late afternoon was beginning to fail. She turned her head on the pillow and a pain went through her temples like a thin knife, and she let her head settle again. The man in the chair did not speak. He did not move toward her. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them, and he watched her the way a man watches a creek to see if the ice will hold. His beard was dark and short. There was iron in his hair at the temples. His eyes were the color of a coming storm. She knew, without being told, that this was the man who had carried her up the mountain. She knew it the way a person knows the shape of a hand that has held them when they were too weak to hold themselves. She tried to speak. Her tongue was thick. She managed on the second try 3 words, "Where am I?" He did not answer her. He stood up slowly, and the chair creaked behind him, and he walked across the room without looking back at her and pulled open a heavy plank door and called out one quiet word into the next room, "Ezra." That was the only word he said. Then he stepped aside and let another man come through the door. The second man was tall, but not as tall as the first, and he had warm, whiskey-colored eyes and a careful kind of way about him, and he was carrying a tin cup in one hand and a hunk of brown bread in the other. He set them down on a small table beside the bed. He pulled a stool over. He sat down. "Easy now, miss," he said. His voice was lower and softer than Della had been expecting. "You have been a long way under. 3 days under, near as I can figure. Drink this slow. It is broth from a snow hare my brother shot day before last. It will sit on your stomach if you do not rush it." She drank. The broth was hot and salty and rich with marrow, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. She got down half the cup before her hands began to shake. He took the cup from her without comment and set it back on the table. "My name is Ezra Hollister," he said. "The man you saw in the chair, the one who went and fetched me, that is my older brother Silas. He does not talk much. There is one more of us. His name is Wyatt, and he is the youngest and the loudest, and you will know him when you hear him. You are at our cabin on Blackwood Ridge. We took you out of the snow at Eagles Point 3 nights ago. You were as close to gone as a body can be and still come back." She nodded once. She found she could not say thank you. The words sat in her throat and would not come out, and she understood, looking at this kind-faced man with his careful hands, that he did not need her to say them. He could see them in her eyes. She tried instead to say the only thing she knew how to say. "My name is Adelaide Whitcomb. My father called me Della." Ezra Hollister smiled. It was a small smile, but a real one. "Della," he said, "that is a fine name. Now you rest. We will talk in the morning. There is no harm coming through that door tonight. My brother Silas is sitting up by the fire, and the wolves know better, and the storm is doing the rest. You are safe here. You hear me, Della. You are safe." She closed her eyes. She heard the chair creak again as the older brother sat back down by the fire. She heard a low murmur of men's voices in the next room, the words too quiet to follow. She heard the wind hit the cabin like a hand slapping a wall, and she heard the cabin hold against it the way a thing built right holds against a thing built wrong. She slept. She slept the rest of that night and the whole of the next day and most of the night after that. When she woke, for true, the storm had gone, and a hard, pale sunlight was coming through the small square window, and a man she had not yet seen was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed and his shoulder against the frame, watching her. He was tall like the others. He had auburn hair, too long for any town, and a fresh stubble of beard and gray eyes the color of a winter sky over open water. There was a bowie knife on his hip the size of a small sword. He did not smile. "You are awake," he said. It was not a welcome. It was a fact. "I am awake," she said. "Good." He pushed off the door frame and walked closer, and he stopped at the foot of the bed and looked down at her with no particular kindness in his face. "My name is Wyatt. We need to know who you are and why you are on our mountain. You can start any time you are ready." Wyatt said, another voice from the doorway behind him. Ezra had appeared there, a wooden bowl in his hands. "Let her eat. Then she will talk." Wyatt did not move. The two brothers looked at each other for a long second, and Della watched them and understood without being told that this was an old argument, the kind of argument brothers carry on for years without ever needing to start it new. Finally, Wyatt stepped back. Ezra brought her the bowl. It was venison stew cut small. She ate it sitting up against a pile of folded blankets, and as she ate, she told them in pieces the whole of it. Boston, her father, Mr. Pemberton from Beacon Hill, the advertisement in the matrimonial news, the letter from a Marcus Reed who did not exist, the wagon train, Cordelia Pike, the pocket watch hidden in her trunk, Cole Briggs, the walk north, the note in her hand that had told her to find the brothers on Blackwood Ridge. When she was finished, she looked up. Ezra's face was grave and still. Wyatt's was harder than it had been before, and his jaw was set, and she did not yet know him well enough to understand that the hardness in his face was not anger at her. It was anger at Jedediah Crane and at Cole Briggs and at every man in the country east of the Mississippi who would prey on a young woman alone. Wyatt had a particular feeling about that kind of man. He had carried it since he was 15 years old and would carry it to his grave. The third man, Silas, stood by the fire with his back to her. He did not turn when she spoke, but she could see even from across the room that his shoulders were set in the particular way of a man listening hard to every word and giving no sign of it. When she had finished, Ezra took the empty bowl from her hands. You will stay with us until the pass opens, he said. His voice was even. That will be in the spring, 5 months, maybe a little more, depending on the weather. You sleep in the small room behind the kitchen. You do not go beyond the dooryard alone. You contribute what you can, cooking, mending, the small work. We will handle the rest. When the snow goes, we will take you to Helena or anywhere else you want to be. That is the arrangement. She nodded. One more thing, Ezra said. Yes. There is a small box on the high shelf in the front room, cedarwood, brass corners. You are not to open that box, not for any reason, not by accident, not in cleaning, not at all. Do you understand me, Della? Yes, she said. I understand. A Hollister man keeps his word, Ezra said quietly, and you will be safe here as long as you are under this roof. That I promise you, but that box you do not touch. She nodded again, and Ezra picked up the bowl and rose and went out, and Wyatt followed him. And at the last moment, Wyatt looked back at her over his shoulder. There was no smile in his face, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, a kind of grudging readiness to wait and see. Silas had not turned from the fire the whole time she was speaking. He did not turn now. The door closed behind his brothers, and the room was quiet, and she lay in the bed and watched the broad back of the man who had carried her up the mountain. He stood there a long time, then he reached up to the mantel, and he took down something small that she could not see, and he held it in his hand a moment, and he set it back, and he walked out of the room without ever once looking at her. The first week of her life on Blackwood Ridge taught her things she had not known a city girl could be taught. Ezra showed her the cabin. It was 3 rooms, a great front room with a stone hearth that took up most of one wall, and a long plank table in the center where the brothers ate and cleaned their guns and read in the evenings, a kitchen behind it with a heavy iron cook stove and rows of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a barrel of flour and another of cornmeal in a pantry stocked deep enough to ride out a hard winter, and a small room behind the kitchen, no bigger than a horse stall, with a narrow bed and a single chair and a little window high up under the eaves, that Ezra said was hers. Behind the cabin against the slope of the mountain was a barn that held 2 black Angus cattle and a chicken coop with 20 laying hens and a brown and white bird dog named Boone, who came to her on the second day and laid his head against her knee and did not move until she rubbed his ears and called him a good fellow. There was a smokehouse and a meat house and a small forge and a workshop where Silas kept his tools and Ezra carved his birds. There was a woodpile against the north wall of the cabin that was taller than she was and longer than the cabin itself. There was also, half hidden in the trees 100 yards behind the cabin, a small fenced plot of ground with a single hand carved stone in it. She saw it on the second morning when she stepped out the door for the first time and stood in the cold blue air. She did not go near it. She did not have to. She knew what it was, the way a person knows a church without being told. Ezra taught her to use the cook stove. Wyatt, against his will, taught her to load and clean a Navy Colt that Ezra had pressed into her hands on the first morning with the words, Della, you are out here now. You do not go without a sidearm, not on this mountain, not in this winter. He showed her how to charge the cylinder, how to seat the ball, how to cap the nipples. He showed her where to place her feet when she fired. She had handled a pistol once before on her grandfather's farm in Vermont when she was 12, and the feel of the iron in her hand was not foreign to her. Wyatt watched her grip and her stance and gave a small grunt that she came to understand later was the closest thing to a compliment a man ever got out of him on a first try. Silas taught her nothing. He did not avoid her exactly. He sat at the same table at meals. He passed the bread when she asked for it. He nodded once when she thanked him for the buffalo robe he had laid across the foot of her bed on the second evening. But he did not speak to her, and he did not look at her any longer than he had to, and when he came in from the wood lot at sundown with snow on his shoulders, he hung his coat by the door and went straight to his chair by the hearth and stayed there until he went in his own time to his own room. She watched him in the way a person watches a still pool of water. She did not know what she was looking for. She did not know why she kept looking. She knew only that he had carried her up the mountain, and that he had not spoken since, and that there was a small cedar box on the high shelf with brass corners that she was not to touch. On the morning of her 9th day, she made her first real mistake. She was carrying a heavy iron skillet from the stove to the table. She had been doing such work since she was 12 years old, and she was not a stranger to a hot pan. But the handle of this particular skillet was older than she was, and the wooden grip had loosened on its rivets, and as she lifted it, her hand turned, and the whole weight of it pitched forward and would have hit the floor and broken her foot if a hand the size of a small ham had not closed around her wrist and taken the skillet from her in one motion. Silas, he had come in from the porch without her hearing him, and he had crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, and he had her wrist in his hand and the skillet in his other, and he was looking down at her from a height she had not until that moment fully understood. His grip was light. He was not holding her hard. He was holding her the way a man holds a thing he is afraid of breaking. But she felt in that one held second the calluses on the inside of his palm. She felt the old rope burns and the small ridges of healed cuts and the long working of leather and iron and wood. She felt also the way his hand stilled when his thumb passed across the back of hers. He had felt something there that he had not expected. He had felt that the back of her hand was not the soft skin of a Boston parlor. It was the worked skin of a girl who had washed her dying mother and her dying father, who had lifted basins and scrubbed floors and carried wood up 4 flights of stairs in a parsonage where they could not afford to hire help, who had calluses of her own at the base of every finger. He looked down at her hand. He looked up at her face. For one full second, his eyes held hers, blue and gray, and old as the mountain itself. She did not breathe. She could not. Then he set the skillet down on the table with a soft clang, and he let her wrist go, and he walked out of the kitchen without a word, and the screen door of the porch banged shut behind him. That night after supper, she watched him from across the room. He sat at the long table with a stub of pencil and a small leather-bound notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He wrote something on a page. He tore the page out. He folded it once. He pushed it across the table toward Ezra without looking up. Ezra opened it and read. He read it twice. He looked over at his brother. Silas did not look back. Ezra closed the paper and he set it down and he said, "Only all right, Silas. All right." Della did not learn until much later what Silas had written that night. Ezra told her on a soft afternoon 2 years on, when the worst was past and they were sitting together on the porch, and she was asking him gently about the early days. Silas had written 6 words. She has worked. Her hands say so. It was Ezra told her the first thing his older brother had said about a woman in writing or in speech in 5 years. 11 nights into her stay on Blackwood Ridge, the wolves came back. She knew them before the brothers did. She had been lying awake in the small room behind the kitchen, listening to the wind, when the wind broke for one moment and she heard far off and then closer the low calling note that she remembered from Eagle's Point. She sat up. She listened. She was not mistaken. She rose and pulled her shawl over her nightdress and walked into the front room. Ezra was already standing at the window with the curtain pulled back 2 fingers width. Wyatt was sliding cartridges into the loading gate of a Winchester repeater. Silas stood at the door with the heavy Sharps rifle in his hands and the door bar already in his other hand. "There are 8 of them," Wyatt said, his voice tight. "Maybe 9. Hungry. They mean it this time." Della said, "Ezra, without turning, take the Colt off the mantel. Stand by the back window. If one comes through that glass, you put it down. Do you understand me, Della?" She took the pistol. She felt the weight of it. She walked to the small back window of the front room and stood beside it with her back to the wall, the way Wyatt had shown her the pistol held low and ready. The first wolf hit the front door. The whole frame shook. Silas put the muzzle of the Sharps to the small loophole cut in the door at chest height for exactly this purpose, and the rifle spoke once deep and full, and the wolf on the other side of the door yelped and went down. Wyatt fired the Winchester through the front window twice fast, and another shape dropped in the moonlit snow. Then the back window. She heard it before she saw it, a scrabble of claws on the wood siding, a scrape of breath, the thick gray shape of a wolf hitting the glass, and the glass going in a single bright crash, and the wolf was through it, head and shoulders into the room, snarling eyes yellow as new-minted gold in the lamplight. She did not hesitate. She did not have time to be afraid. She brought the pistol up the way Wyatt had taught her, both hands on the grip, the front sight set on the white blaze of the wolf's chest, and she squeezed the trigger. The Colt jumped in her hands. The sound in the small room was enormous. The wolf dropped halfway through the broken window and slid back down the wall and lay still on the puncheon floor with its tongue out and its eyes already going dim. She stood there with the pistol smoking and her ears ringing and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Silas came through the doorway in a run with the Sharps in one hand and his face set hard and ready to kill anything in the room that needed killing. He stopped 2 strides in. He looked at the wolf on the floor. He looked at the broken window. He looked last of all at her. She was still standing where she had been told to stand. Her back was against the wall. The pistol was held low and pointed at the floor the way Wyatt had taught her to hold it after a shot. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were not. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. It was not much of a nod, but it was the first one he had ever given her. Behind him in the front room, Wyatt fired the Winchester twice more, and the rest of the pack broke and ran. They could hear the yelps fading away into the timber. It took the better part of an hour to nail oilcloth across the broken back window and drag the bodies of the dead wolves out into the snow and bar the door again. The 4 of them sat in the front room afterward with the fire built up and tin cups of hot coffee in their hands and the smell of black powder still in the air. No one spoke for a long while. Wyatt was working a cleaning rag down the bore of the Winchester. Ezra was sitting back in his chair with one boot on his knee and his eyes half closed. Silas was at the long table. He had his notebook out. He wrote for a long time, 3 pages, 4. He tore out the last page and folded it once, and he did not pass it to Ezra this time. He stood up and he walked to where Della was sitting near the fire with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and he set the folded page down on the small table at her elbow without ever quite meeting her eyes. Then he went out onto the porch with his coffee in his hand, and he stood there in the cold, looking out at the snow. Della picked up the folded page. She opened it. The handwriting was tight and even, the writing of a man who had once kept books and had not lost the habit. There were 4 short lines. You held your fire until the shot was sure. You did not move when you were told to stand. My brother taught my wife to shoot in the spring of 1873. She never learned. You learned in 9 days. Thank you for what you did tonight. S. She read it twice. She read it 3 times, then she folded it very carefully the way her father had taught her to fold a love letter from a soldier so that the creases would not weaken the paper, and she slid it inside the worn Bible at the page of the 23rd Psalm, and she sat looking at the fire. Across the room, Ezra was watching her with quiet eyes. He did not speak. He did not have to. She understood, looking at his face, that something had happened tonight that was larger than the wolves and the broken window and the dead animals being dragged out into the snow. Silas Hollister had written a sentence to a woman who was not his dead wife. He had thanked her. He had compared her to Eleanor and not turned his face away. It was in that house, in that silence, the breaking of something that had been frozen a long time. Ezra waited until the next afternoon to tell her the rest. Silas had gone up the slope with Wyatt to check a trap line. The 2 of them sat at the long table. Ezra carved at a small piece of cedar that was beginning under his knife to take the shape of a wren. Della was kneading bread. He has not spoken aloud of his own free will in 5 years, Ezra said quietly. Not since the winter our brother lost Eleanor. He spoke 6 words to me last night when he gave me your name and asked me to stoke the fire. 6 words, Della. I have not heard him put 6 words together in one breath since the spring of 74. She did not stop kneading. She kept her hands busy because she did not want him to see them shake. What happened to her, she asked. Ooh. She died, Ezra said. He did not look up from the wren. He went out to check the cattle in a storm. He told her he would be back by sundown. He could not get back. The storm pinned him in a line shack 3 days. When he made it home, she was gone. She had taken sick in his absence and tried to ride for the doctor herself. Her horse came back without her. He found her in their bed. When he got home, she had crawled there to die. Della stood with flour on her wrists and the smell of yeast in her nose, and her father's words from the last morning of his life moving through her mind. A path would open. A path had opened. It had only opened in a place she had not expected and would never have chosen. He swore he would not say another word. Ezra went on, his voice low and steady. He said the last word he had spoken to her was a promise he could not keep, and he did not deserve any more words after that. He has held to that promise more or less for 5 years. Wyatt and I have learned to read his face and his hands, and we have spoken for him when there was speaking to be done. He goes down behind the cabin every first day of the month with a dried alpine flower for her. He has not allowed any other woman to sleep under this roof in 5 years, not a single one. Ezra set down the knife. Until you, he said. She stood very still. Ezra picked up the wren again. He did not look at her. He let her have the moment to herself. That afternoon, when the brothers came back from the trap line, Della did something she had not been able to bring herself to do in 11 days. She walked out the back door and across the yard and through the small gate of the picket fence behind the cabin, and she stood at the foot of Eleanor Hollister's grave. The stone was hand-cut. It was not fancy. It said in deep, careful chiseling, Eleanor Ashford Hollister, wife, 1851 to 1874. She was loved. There was a small crock of dried alpine flowers at the base of the stone. Edelweiss, she thought, though she had only seen pictures of Edelweiss in a book. It was the first day of December, she realized. He had been down here that morning before the sun came up. She did not say anything aloud. She did not pray. She only stood there with her hands folded in front of her and the wind moving in her hair, and she said in the silence of her own mind, I am sorry I am here, Eleanor Hollister. I did not mean to come. I did not mean to wear your husband out. I do not know what I am to him or he to me, but I will not hurt him. I promise you that. I will not hurt the man you loved. If God lets me leave this mountain in the spring, I will leave it, and if God does not, I will be careful with him. That much I can give you. She stood there a while longer. The wind moved in the pines. Somewhere up the slope, she heard the ring of an axe, slow and steady, the sound of Silas Hollister splitting wood the way he had split wood every afternoon of his life since he was 9 years old. She turned and walked back to the cabin. She did not see, because he was working with his back to her, that he had stopped his axe halfway through a stroke when he saw her standing at his wife's grave. He had stood there a long minute, the axe head down in the snow at his feet, watching her bowed head. Then he had turned away and brought the axe up again and gone back to his work, but his eyes had been wet, and he had not let his brother see, and by the time he came in for supper that night, his face was as still and quiet as it had been for 5 years. Only it was not the same face. It would not be the same face again. Something had begun to move in him that he did not yet have a name for. Something had begun to thaw. That night, after the others had gone to bed, Silas Hollister sat at the long table by the dying fire and took out his small leather notebook, and he turned to a fresh page and he wrote 2 lines slowly in a hand that was not quite steady. She prayed at the grave today. She did not know I do not know what is happening to me. He looked at the words. He read them once. Then he tore the page out and he folded it twice, and he held it for a long second over the embers of the hearth, meaning to drop it in. He did not drop it. He folded it a third time and he tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat against his heart, and he sat looking into the fire a long time before he went to bed. Outside the cabin on Blackwood Ridge, the snow had begun to fall again. It was a soft snow this time, not a hard one. It settled gently on the picket fence behind the house and on the carved stone at the head of Eleanor Hollister's grave and on the roof of the cabin where 4 people were now sleeping under one roof for the first time in 5 winters. In the small room behind the kitchen, Della Whitcomb slept with the old Bible held against her chest and a folded piece of paper safe between its pages, and she did not yet know that in another room, only a wall away, the man who had carried her out of the snow had begun very quietly to write his first words back into the world. The arrangement, as Ezra Hollister had laid it out, had 11 nights in. The pass was still 5 months from opening. There was a cedar box on a high shelf with brass corners that no one was to touch. And somewhere in the dark between that high shelf and the small room behind the kitchen, a long winter had only just begun. The cedar box came down off the high shelf on a gray afternoon in the middle of December. It did not come down because Della Whitcomb meant for it to come down. It came down because the wind that morning had blown a flue cap loose and the front room had filled with smoke, and Ezra had asked her to climb up on the kitchen stool and dust the high shelves while the men opened the windows and worked on the chimney from the roof. She had taken the rag in her hand and climbed the stool in her work apron, and she had moved a row of leather-bound ledgers and a tin of bullets and a small stack of old almanacs. And there it had been, a box of pale cedar, no bigger than a Bible with brass corners gone soft with age. The grain of the wood was the color of new honey. There were 2 initials burned into the lid in a flowing script, E and H. She remembered Ezra's words from the first day. You are not to open that box, not for any reason, not by accident, not in cleaning, not at all. She did not open it. She made herself not open it. She held it in her 2 hands and stood on the stool, and she only looked at it. She told herself that she was only moving it down to dust the shelf. She told herself that she would set it back exactly as she had found it. She told herself a great many true things and one untrue thing underneath them all, which was that she had wondered every night since the night of the wolves what was inside that box and why a man would not allow another soul on his mountain to touch it. She set the box down on the long plank table to dust the shelf behind it. She dusted carefully. She put the ledgers back. She put the tin of bullets back. She put the almanacs back. Then she turned to pick the box up again. The lid had come open, not all the way, only a finger's width. The latch must have been loose, or the lid worked free in the carrying. It sat on the table with that small, dark line of opening showing along its edge, and from inside it she could see the faint, dull shine of silver and the soft gray gleam of a coil of dark hair tied with a faded blue ribbon. She did not lift the lid. She told herself with the part of her mind that her father had trained that it had simply opened on its own, and she had only to close it again and put it back. But her hand was already on the lid, and she had only meant to close it, and instead, somehow slowly, the way a person walks into a room she has been told all her life never to enter, she lifted the lid the rest of the way. There was a small oval locket of old silver on a chain. Inside the locket was a painted miniature of a young woman with dark hair pulled back from a face that was thin and quiet and beautiful in a still and serious way. There was a coil of that same dark hair tied in a blue ribbon. There was a folded square of paper that she did not unfold, but that she could see through the thinness of the foolscap had a few short lines of handwriting on it, the kind of careful, slow handwriting of a wife writing a poem to a husband. And at the bottom of the box, settled into a small scoop of velvet, there was a plain gold wedding band. Della stood looking down at the contents of the cedar box for what could not have been more than 3 seconds. Boots on the porch. She did not have time to close the lid. The door swung open. Silas Hollister came in with snow on his shoulders and the chimney brush in his hand, and his hair pushed back damp from where he had wiped his forehead. He saw her at the table. He saw the open box. He saw what was in it. He stopped where he stood. She had only seen his face hard before. She had seen it tired, and she had seen it grieving, and she had seen it set quiet. She had not seen it like this. The blood went out of it. The color went out of it. His mouth pulled back at the corners, the way a man pulls back from a hot stove. His shoulders went up an inch. His breath came in once fast and held. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not say anything. He could not. He had not given himself the right to say anything for 5 years. He took the lid of the box out of her hand, and he closed it with a soft click of the brass latch. And he picked up the box and held it against his chest with both hands, the way a man holds a wounded child. She saw then that his hands were shaking. "I am sorry," she said. The words came out of her in a rush, half whisper, half plea. "I am so very sorry. I did not mean to. The lid came loose when I did not mean to." He looked at her. He looked at her with eyes that had gone almost black with grief, and the muscle working in his jaw, and the small box of his dead wife's keepsakes pressed against his ribs. And for a long second, she thought he would say something, at last would break, would let one word out of him at her after 11 days, and her heart hung in her chest, waiting for it. He did not speak. He turned. He walked past her. He went out the door he had just come in through. He did not slam it. He closed it behind him with great care, the way a man closes the door of a sick room, and the latch caught, and his boots went down off the porch and across the yard and out through the picket gate behind the cabin. And she did not see him again until long after dark. She sat at the long table, and she put her face in her hands, and she cried in the soundless way she had learned to cry in her father's pantry when she was 17 and her mother had just died. Ezra found her there an hour later when he came down from the roof with soot on his sleeves. He did not ask what had happened. He looked at her face, and he looked at the empty space on the high shelf, and he looked out the window toward where his brother had gone, and he understood the whole of it in one slow breath. He sat down across from her at the long table. He folded his hands in front of him. "I will not lie to you, Della," he said quietly. "That was a hard thing for him. He has not opened that box in 5 years. He has not let any of us touch it. He will need a little time." "I did not mean to," she said. "The lid came loose." I told him. "I know, he knows too. Give him until the morning." She nodded. She wiped her face with the corner of her apron. She rose and went into the kitchen and started supper because there was nothing else to do, and she had learned long ago in a Boston row house that grief does not exempt a woman from putting bread on a table. Silas did not come in for supper. The 3 of them ate without him. Wyatt did not say a word the whole meal. Ezra spoke once only to ask her to pass the salt, and his voice was gentle. After the dishes were dried and the lamps trimmed, Ezra and Wyatt went to bed. Della stayed up. She sat in the chair by the dying fire with her shawl around her shoulders and her father's Bible in her lap, and she waited. It was past midnight when she heard his boots on the porch. He came in slowly. He shut the door behind him without sound. He did not see her at first because the lamp had burned low and the chair was in shadow. He walked to the long table and set the cedar box on it, and he took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door, and he stood with his back to her, his shoulders set, his head bowed. There was snow in his beard. There was a hard, thin line of frostburn across his cheekbone where the wind had cut him. She rose from the chair. He turned at the small sound of her skirt. He stood looking at her. She stood looking at him. The fire popped in the hearth. He walked to the long table. He sat down on the bench. He pulled his small leather notebook out of the inside pocket of his coat where he had hung it, and he opened it on the table, and he picked up his stub of pencil, and he wrote. He wrote a long time, 3 pages, 4. The lamp burned lower. She did not move from where she stood. She only watched him write, the great breadth of his shoulders bent over the small book, the slow, careful hand of a man who had been a bookkeeper once and had not lost the habit, the muscle in his forearm working as he formed each letter. When he was done, he tore out the pages. He folded them once. He held them in his hand a long moment. Then he looked up at her and he held them out across the table. She walked to him. She took the pages from his hand. She felt his fingers brush hers. and his hand was very cold, and she sat down on the bench across from him with the pages in her lap. She read. Her name was Eleanor Ashford. She was from Pittsburgh. Her father was a foundryman, and her mother was a Sunday school teacher, and she had 3 sisters. I met her at a dance in Cheyenne in the fall of 72. I was 33. She was 21. I asked her to marry me on the third time we sat down to talk. She said yes on the fourth. I gave her the ring my mother had left me when she died. We were married in May of 73 by a circuit preacher in Cheyenne in a small white church with the windows open to the prairie wind. I built her a house on 1,000 acres my father had left me in Wyoming. She put up curtains. She planted a kitchen garden. She wanted 3 children and a piano. We were happy for 1 year. In the November of 74, the storm came in. I rode out to count the cattle in the morning. I told her I would be back by sundown. The storm closed in over the high country at about 2 o'clock that afternoon, and by 4, it had me pinned in a line shack 12 miles from the house. I waited it out 3 days. I tried twice to ride home in it, and twice the horse turned back on me. When I made it home on the 4th day, the fire was cold and the lamp was out, and she was upstairs in the bed. She had taken sick in my absence. She had tried to ride to the doctor. The horse had thrown her. She had walked back through the snow. I do not know how far. She had crawled into our bed and pulled the quilt over her, and she had died there alone waiting for me. The doctor said pneumonia. 3 days alone with a fever. I was 12 miles away. The last word I said to her on this earth was promise. I said, I promise I will be back by sundown. I broke that promise and it killed her. I swore at her grave that I would never speak another voluntary word because a man who breaks that kind of word does not deserve to use them anymore. I have kept that oath more or less for 5 years. I have spoken to my brothers when I had to. I have not spoken aloud to any other living soul. The box you opened today is the only thing of hers I kept. I take it down on her birthday and on our wedding day, and I hold it. I have not opened it any other time in 5 years. When I saw you with it open today, I thought my chest would split. I am not angry at you, Della. I am angry at myself because in the moment I saw you holding what I have not let myself hold, I knew that I have wanted to set it down for a long time. And I have not been brave enough. You have nothing to be sorry for. I am the one who is sorry. I am sorry I have been a stone in this house for 11 days. You have not deserved that. I do not know what to do with what I am beginning to feel, and I am afraid of it. But I owe you these words, and so I have written them. S. She read the pages twice. The second time she read them, she could not see the writing because her eyes had filled. She set the pages down on the table between them. She picked up his pencil. She wrote very carefully on the bottom of the last page, I do not believe Eleanor would have wanted you to stop speaking. I believe she would have wanted you to live. Are you living, Silas Hollister? D. She turned the page so it was facing him. She slid it back across the table. He read it. He read it slowly. He bowed his head. She saw as the lamplight caught it, a single bright thing fall from his face onto the page and bloom there like a small dark flower in the ink. The first tear he had cried in the seeing of another human soul in 5 years. He did not look up at her. He could not. He reached his hand across the long table, palm up slow and steady. He laid it open on the wood between them. She put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers. He held her hand the way a drowning man holds a rope, not too tight, only enough to know it was there. He held it a long minute. The fire popped. The wind worked at the eaves. Somewhere outside in the dark, a single coyote sang a long, thin note across the snow and was answered far off by another. He let her hand go. He stood up. He took the cedar box off the table, and he set it back on the high shelf gently with both hands. He came back to the table. He picked up the folded pages, and he tore them in half, and he tore them in half again, and he laid the pieces in the heart of the fire, and they took flame, and the writing burned, and the smoke went up the chimney into the night. He did not need them anymore. He had said the words once. That was enough. The words could go. He turned to her. He inclined his head. It was not quite a bow, but it was something. He walked to his own door, and he opened it, and he went into his room, and he closed it softly behind him. In the morning when she went to make breakfast, there was a single dried alpine flower lying on her pillow, a small star of edelweiss, the kind he had been bringing to his wife's grave for 5 years. She held it in her palm a long time. She understood. She did not need it explained. The hard thing about a thaw on a mountain in winter is that the thaw is never honest. It comes in the daytime, and it takes the snow off the south-facing rocks, and it puts a shine on the creek, and it makes a man who has lived in the country a long time forget what he knows. Then the night comes, and the cold comes back, and the water that ran in the daylight freezes, hard and gray, over the running creek beneath. underneath, and a man who steps on it cannot tell until he is in it that it is not the snow he was walking on yesterday. It was the 17th of February. Silas Hollister had walked the trap line every other morning for 19 winters. He walked it now with the sharps over his shoulder and his fur cap pulled down to his ears and the ice axe in his hand, and the sun had come up clean and bright, and there had been a thaw the day before. He came to Bear Creek at the place where the line crossed it, where there was a flat run of granite under the water that made for a hard, easy crossing, and he stepped out onto what looked like the same gray ice he had crossed all winter. It was not the same gray ice. The thaw the day before had cut it from underneath, and the night had skimmed a thin new sheet over the weakness, and that thin sheet was perhaps an inch thick where there should have been 6. It went under him in one long crack, like a rifle going off in a barn. He fell straight down into Bear Creek. The water took the breath out of him in one shock. The creek was not deep there, only to his chest, but the cold of it was the cold of a thing that wanted to kill you. His boots filled at once, his coat soaked through in 3 breaths. He had the presence of mind to throw the rifle clear onto the bank and to drive the head of the ice axe into the solid ice at the edge of the break and to drag himself up out of the water with his arms shaking and his teeth already locked. He stood on the bank in his soaked clothes, and he counted the way a hunter counts the seconds between a flash and a thunder. He had perhaps 15 minutes before the wet wool of his clothes froze stiff on him, and his body could not warm itself fast enough. And after that, he had perhaps 15 more before he stopped being able to think. And after that, he had whatever the cold gave him, which was nothing. The cabin was 1.25 miles up the slope. He ran. He ran the way a man runs when his life is in the running, not pretty, not measured, only running. He left the rifle, he left the ice axe. The trap line did not matter. Nothing mattered but the slope and the line of his own boots and the snow and the thin column of cabin smoke 1.25 miles above him. He fell twice, he got up twice. The second time he got up, he could not feel his hands and he could not close his fingers, and he had to use his elbows against a tree trunk to lever himself upright. He kept going. He came into the dooryard of the cabin with his face the color of bone and his beard a single sheet of frost, and his eyes wide and not quite seeing. He hit the porch step and went down on his knees on the planks. He did not have the strength left in his arms to lift the latch. The door opened. Della had heard the boots on the porch. She had seen through the kitchen window the way he was running. She got the door open in time to catch him as he went forward through it, and the weight of him almost took her down with him. But she was a sturdy girl who had carried sick men up and down a Boston staircase for 6 years, and she got him onto the buffalo robe in front of the hearth. Ezra, Wyatt, get in here now. Her voice carried through the small cabin like a bell. They came at a run from the barn, both of them, and the moment Wyatt saw his brother's face, he said one bad word under his breath and dropped to one knee beside him. "Stove fire up high," Della said. She had taken charge. She did not know she had taken charge. It had simply happened. "Heat the bricks, 3 of the small ones, wrap them in flannel. Ezra, I need you to get him out of those clothes. I will turn my back. Wyatt, the trade blanket from my bed and the buffalo robe off the chair. Now." She was already at the kitchen, already pulling down the tin of willow bark and the small clay jar of honey and the kettle she kept on the stove for exactly this kind of trouble. She was already a doctor's daughter and a minister's daughter and a girl who had nursed her father through pneumonia not 9 months ago, and the part of her that knew what to do had taken hold of her hands. She did not look back at the men until Ezra called all right. She turned. Silas was wrapped to the chin in the buffalo robe and the trade blanket, and there were 2 hot bricks at his feet and one against the small of his back, and his lips were moving without sound. She brought the willow bark tea. She brought a cup of broth. She knelt on the buffalo robe beside him, and she lifted his head onto her knee, and she fed him the broth a spoon at a time, and most of it ran out the corner of his mouth, and some of it got down. His eyes were not seeing her. He was looking past her at something a long way off, and his lips were moving, and he was saying a name very softly under his breath, "Eleanor." She did not flinch. She did not weep. She wiped his mouth with the corner of her apron. She fed him another spoonful. He fell into a true fever by sundown. The fever ran for 3 days. In those 3 days, she did not leave his side. She told Ezra on the second morning to bring her father's Bible from the small room behind the kitchen. She read aloud to Silas through the long afternoons. She read him the 23rd Psalm slowly, the way her father had read it. She read him the Sermon on the Mount. She read him the 8th chapter of the letter to the Romans, where it says that nothing in heaven or on earth shall separate us from the love of God. She read him those passages over and over until her own voice cracked, and she put willow bark tea down his throat every 2 hours, and she changed the cool cloth on his forehead every 20 minutes, and she did not sleep. Ezra stood at the door and watched her and did not interrupt. Wyatt, who had never in his life been able to sit still in a sick room, found other ways to help. He chopped wood. He carried it. He kept the fire so high through those 3 nights that the cabin was hot as a kitchen at noon. He fed Boone the dog. He did the small chores of the barn that his older brother had always done. He did not say much. He did not have to. On the 3rd night, Silas's fever broke. She was alone with him when it happened. Ezra had finally lain down in the front room. Wyatt was asleep in his chair with his boots still on. The cabin was very quiet. The fire was burning low. She had her hand on his forehead, and his skin had been hot as a stove all evening, and now under her palm she felt it cool. She felt it cool the way a stone cools when the sun goes down. She felt the sweat break across his brow like a wave. She drew her hand back. She watched him. His eyes opened. They were focused. They were his own eyes. They found her face in the lamplight. They held her. His hand came out of the buffalo robe slowly with effort, and it groped for hers across the small space between them. She gave him her hand. He closed his fingers around it. His grip was weak. It was the grip of a man who has come a long way back. His lips moved. He had to try twice. The voice that came out of him was a rough thread of sound, the voice of a man whose throat had not done this work in 5 years, Della. It was the first word he had said aloud of his own free will since he had stood at his wife's grave in November of 1874. He said it to her. He said it looking at her. He said it with a full breath. He said it the way a man names a thing he loves. She bowed her head over his hand, and she wept the way she had not let herself weep since the Tuesday in October when her father had closed his eyes for the last time. She wept without sound in great long shudders, and the tears ran off her face onto the back of his hand. "Easy," he whispered. The word was a scrape. "Easy now, Della. I am here." She lifted her face. She tried to speak. She could not. She nodded. He closed his eyes. He smiled very faintly, as a man smiles in his sleep. His grip on her hand relaxed, but he did not let go. He went down into a clean, true sleep, the sleep of healing, and his breath was deep and slow, and the color came back into his face by degrees. Ezra came in from the front room a little while later. He saw their hands joined on the buffalo robe. He saw her face. He understood. He turned and went out without speaking, and he stood on the porch a long time, looking up at the cold, high stars over Blackwood Ridge and at the great wheel of the Milky Way burning above the timber, and he wept, too, in his own way for his older brother, for what had been broken open and what had been given back. In the morning, Silas woke and asked for water. He drank a full cup. He asked for broth. He drank that, too. By noon, he was sitting up against pillows. By the 2nd day after the fever broke, he was on his feet for an hour at a time. By the end of the week, he was speaking slowly, carefully, the way a man tries a leg that has been broken and reset. He spoke to his brothers first. He spoke to Ezra at the breakfast table on the morning after the fever, 2 whole sentences in a row, and Ezra had to set down his coffee cup and look out the window to keep the rest of them from seeing his face. He spoke to Wyatt the next afternoon, 3 words about the wood splitter and a question about the bay mare's foot. And Wyatt swore and laughed and clapped his older brother on the shoulder hard enough to rock him. He spoke to Della last. He spoke to her on the evening of the 4th day when she brought him a cup of coffee at the chair by the fire. He took the cup. He looked up at her. His voice was still rough with disuse, but it was steady now. "Winter always ends, Della Whitcomb," he said, "but I did not believe a word of it until you. Thank you." She did not trust herself to answer. She only put her hand on his shoulder. He laid his hand over hers and held it there. The fire popped. Outside in the picket-fenced plot behind the cabin, a single bare patch of dark ground had begun to show through the snow at the foot of Eleanor Hollister's stone, and the alpine wind had begun ever so faintly to carry a different smell on it, a green smell, the smell that comes a long way ahead of the spring. The thaw was coming. They did not know yet that it was bringing more than the green back to the high country. They did not know that down in Helena, in a dirty room above a saloon on Last Chance Gulch, a man named Jedediah Crane was sitting at a table with 2 hired guns, a Texan named Bill Harden and a Deadwood gun hand named Frank Mott, and a folded map between them, and that the map had a single penciled circle on it, and that the circle was drawn around the words Blackwood Ridge. But that is a story for the part of the night that is still to come. The first true sign of spring came on a morning in the middle of March. Della was hanging out the wash on the line that Ezra had rigged between 2 cedar posts in the dooryard, and she heard a sound she had not heard since the day she walked up off the prairie with Cordelia Pike's note folded in her hand. A meadowlark, one single clear 3-note call out of the brush at the edge of the timber, and then another one answering it from the south slope, and then silence. But the sound stayed in the air like a coin dropped into water. The world was waking up. She finished hanging the shirt she was working on, and she stood there with her hand on the rope and her face turned toward the place the bird had called from, and she felt the warmth of the sun on her cheek, and she understood the way a person understands a thing without thinking it through, that the season was about to turn and her life was about to turn with it. Behind her, the cabin door opened, and Silas came out onto the porch with 2 tin cups in his hands. He had taken to bringing her coffee in the middle of the morning since the fever. It was a small thing. It was a great thing. He set 1 cup down on the porch rail, and he carried the other one over to her, and he held it out without speaking, and she took it, and their fingers brushed in the passing of it, and neither of them looked away. "You are smiling," he said. His voice had got back almost to what it must have been before. Deep, slow, the voice of a man who measured every word because he had been 5 years without them. "There was a meadowlark," she said, "just now, from the bottom of the meadow." He looked off toward the meadow. He smiled, too. It was still a strange thing to see his face do that. It had been doing it more since the fever. It still surprised her every time. "I have not heard one of those," he said, "since the fall. Spring is closer than I thought." She wrapped her hands around the warmth of the cup. She did not look at him. She looked at the steam rising off the coffee. "The pass will open," she said. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Yes. The pass will open." She nodded. She did not say anything else. He did not say anything else. They stood there in the dooryard with the wash flapping in the morning sun behind them, and the meadowlark called once more from the brush, and Silas Hollister set his cup down on the porch rail beside hers, and he took her cup out of her hand and set it down too, and he turned her toward him. He did not embrace her. He did not pull her in. He took her hands instead, both of them, and he held them in his own, and his hands were warm now where they had been cold the night by the fire, and he looked down at her with the eyes she had known for 1 full second across a snowdrift on Eagle's Point, and had never quite been able to forget since. "There is a place I want to take you," he said, "up the hollow. I have not been there in 5 years. Will you come with me, Della Whitcomb?" She nodded. She did not trust her voice. He saw it in her face. He let her hands go, and he turned, and he said over his shoulder after dinner, "Bring your shawl." He walked off the porch toward the barn, and she stood there with her hands held out a little from her body, the way a person holds her hands when she has just let go of something she did not know she was carrying. The hollow was a 1/4 mile up the slope on the south-facing side of the ridge, where a small thread of water came down off a bench of granite and made a pool no bigger than a wagon bed at the foot of 2 old aspens. The aspens had been the first trees in that little fold of land to turn green. There was already a soft fuzz of new leaf on their branches, the color of new money, the color the world goes when it has decided to forgive itself another year. Silas led her up the trail and stopped beside the pool. He did not let go of her hand. He had not let go of her hand since the porch. "I brought Eleanor here once," he said. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the water. The first spring we were married, she picked a flower from that bank there, and she pressed it in our family Bible. I have not been here since." She did not speak. She felt his hand tighten just a little on hers. "I told myself," he said, "that I would never bring another woman here. I told myself a lot of things. I told myself I was finished. I told myself I had used up everything in me that had any use to a living soul. I told myself I would die on this mountain alone, and that would be the right end for a man like me." He turned to her. He took her other hand, too. He looked down at her with the storm in his eyes gone quiet, the way a sky goes quiet after a long rain. "I was wrong, Della Whitcomb. I was wrong about all of it. You did not push me. You did not ask anything of me. You only walked into my house out of the snow, and you sat at my table, and you did the work that needed doing, and you held my hand the night I should have died, and somewhere in there, without meaning to, you put me back together. I do not know how. I will not pretend I know how. But you did." She felt the tears on her face before she felt herself begin to cry. She did not move. She did not want to break the moment. "I am not asking you to be Eleanor," he said. His voice went lower. "I am not asking you to take her place. There is no taking her place. She had her place, and she will always have it. What I am asking is for you to take a place of your own, beside me, as my wife, if you will have me, if a broken thing like me is something you can want." She lifted his hands to her face. She held them against her cheek. She was crying without sound, the way she had cried in her father's pantry, only this time it was not grief. "I came west," she said, "to marry a man who did not exist. I do not believe the Lord brought me through that snow for nothing. I do not believe he let me put my hand to that pistol and shoot a wolf through a broken window for nothing. I do not believe he let me sit with you while the fever broke for nothing. I believe he brought me here for you. I have believed it longer than I have wanted to say." She lowered his hands. She looked up at him. "Yes, Silas Hollister, I will have you. With every broken thing in you, I will have you." He bent his head and he kissed her. It was a kiss that had been waiting since the night of the cedar box. It was a kiss that was not in a hurry and not afraid and not graceful and not anything but the simple meeting of 2 mouths that had been alone too long and had finally found a thing to say without words. The wind moved in the aspens. The water made the small, clean sound of water moving over stone. Somewhere in the brush, a chickadee called to its mate. When he lifted his head, he kept her face in his hands. He looked at her a long moment. "You are home," he said. "You are home now, Della, right where you are supposed to be. This mountain chose you. It chose you the day I carried you up off that ridge, and I just took the long way around to admit it." She laughed and she cried at the same time. She laid her forehead against his chest. He folded her in. They stood that way a long time. Neither of them saw, because the brush was thick on the south slope of the hollow and the wind was carrying the wrong way. The small movement on the ridge above them, the brief flash of sun on a brass fitting where a man with a spyglass had lowered it slowly, and the slow, careful movement back into the timber of three men who had been watching them from the rocks. Jedediah Crane folded the spyglass and put it in his coat pocket. Texas Bill Hardin spat into the snow at his feet. Frank Mott checked the loads in his Smith & Wesson and snapped the cylinder back into place. "Tomorrow morning," said Jedediah Crane, "we come up at first light. Three of us. Even bet. And the woman." "The woman comes with us," said Texas Bill. "The woman comes with me," said Jedediah Crane. His voice was very flat. "Are we going to have a problem about that?" Frank Mott looked from Crane to Hardin and back. He shrugged. "No problem here," he said. The three of them turned and went back down through the timber to the hollow where they had left the horses and the chickadees in the brush above the spring pool, called to their mates one more time, and the meadowlark on the bottom of the meadow called once for the day, and a man and a woman stood beside a thread of water in a fold of the land and did not yet know that the last act of their long winter was about to begin. They came at first light. Three riders out of the south timber, picking their way up the slope through the slush of an early thaw, the steel of their bridles catching the sunrise as they came. Boone began to bark from the porch a quarter mile before they were in sight. He was an old dog now. He still knew the smell of trouble. Wyatt heard him first. Wyatt was always first to hear that kind of sound. He came out of the barn with the Winchester in his hand and his Bowie knife on his hip, and he saw them on the trail, and he turned and he shouted up at the cabin riders, three of them, and he was already crossing the dooryard at a run by the time the front door opened. Silas came out with the Sharps. Ezra came out a step behind him with a Spencer carbine and a belt of cartridges. Della came out last with the Navy Colt loaded and ready, and her hair pinned up and her sleeves pushed back to the elbow and her face the color of milk but her eyes steady. The three brothers fanned out across the dooryard the way wolves fan out when they hunt. They had not done it in a long time. They had been three brothers on a mountain for 5 years, splitting wood and minding their own. But before that, they had been three brothers who rode for the Hollister Ranch in a country where men sometimes had to settle their own quarrels, and the old positions came back to them without thinking. Silas at center with the long rifle, Ezra on the left where the line of sight was longest, Wyatt on the right with the lever action where he could move fast. Della stood on the porch behind them with the Colt held low in her two hands the way Wyatt had taught her, the front sight tucked just under her line of vision where she could bring it up in less than a heartbeat. The riders came up the trail and they stopped about 30 yards from the dooryard, and the man in front took off his black hat and made a small theatrical bow from the saddle. "Mr. Hollister," said Jedediah Crane. His voice carried thin and clear in the morning air. "I believe you are holding a young lady who belongs to me. I have come to collect her." Silas did not answer. He did not move. His thumb was on the hammer of the Sharps, and the muzzle of it was pointed at the ground between Crane's horse's hooves, which was as close to a yes or a no as a man like Silas Hollister gave to a man like Jedediah Crane. "The young lady's name is Adelaide Whitcomb." Crane went on. He was talking too much. He was a man who talked too much when he was nervous. "She is wanted by the law in Helena for the theft of a silver pocket watch belonging to my person. I have the warrant in my coat. I have come to take her back to face her charge, peaceable if I can, otherwise if I must." Silas spoke. His voice was the same voice he had used the night the fever broke, only colder. "Get off my mountain," he said. Crane smiled, the thin smile he had smiled at Della on the prairie. "Mr. Hollister," he said, "you misunderstand. I am not asking." Wyatt's Winchester came up, so did Ezra's Spencer. Three barrels were now pointed at Jedediah Crane and his two hired men. The hired men were professionals. Texas Bill Hardin had ridden with a Quantrill remnant in his younger days, and Frank Mott had killed a man in Deadwood for $40 and a horse, and neither of them was a fool. They saw the three rifle barrels. They saw the way the three brothers had set themselves. They saw also the woman on the porch with the pistol held the way it was held. Texas Bill's hand drifted away from his gun belt. Frank Mott more slowly did the same. Crane said Texas Bill quietly, without taking his eyes off Wyatt, "You did not say anything about her being inside a fortified position with three rifles." "Shut up," said Crane. "She is wanted for theft," said Texas Bill more loudly. "Theft is a misdemeanor. I do not get shot for a misdemeanor. That is not what we agreed." Della stepped forward off the porch. She walked past Silas and past Ezra and past Wyatt, and she stopped in the middle of the dooryard with the pistol still in her hands and the morning sun on her hair. She set the pistol down very carefully on the stump of the chopping block where the brothers split kindling, and she straightened up and she looked at Jedediah Crane. "I will go with you," she said. The whole world went still. "Della," said Silas. His voice was tight. Her name was the first word out of him, and it was a question, and it was a no, and it was a thing breaking all at the same time. She did not turn. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Crane. "I will go with you," she said, "on one condition. You leave this family alone. You ride me back to Helena, and you let me face whatever charge you have brought against me in front of the United States Marshal who serves the territory. I will go. I will not fight you. I will not argue. But you do not raise a hand against any of these men. You do not come back up this mountain. You ride out of here with me on the back of your saddle, and you are done with the Hollister family forever. Do you understand me, Mr. Crane?" Crane stared at her. He did not believe what he was hearing. Neither did the men behind her. "Della," said Silas again. He was moving toward her now. She put up a hand without turning around and stopped him. "I made a promise to a woman in a graveyard," she said quietly. The wind carried her words just to the men behind her, no farther. "I told her I would not hurt the man she loved. I did not know what that promise was going to cost me when I made it, but I am keeping it now." She picked the pistol up off the chopping block. She held it out to Wyatt Butt first. "Take this," she said. "I will not need it where I'm going." Wyatt did not take the pistol. He stared at her with his mouth open. He looked at his oldest brother. Silas had gone the color of bone. Silas was standing in the middle of the dooryard with the sharps in his hand and a look on his face that none of them, not even Ezra, had seen on him before. It was the look he had worn at Eleanor's grave 5 years ago. The look of a man being asked to give up a thing he could not give up and survive. Ezra was the one who moved. Ezra stepped forward and he laid a hand on Silas's arm lightly, and he leaned in and he said something in Silas's ear that no one else heard. Silas closed his eyes for one full second. When he opened them, the look was gone. In its place was something else, the look of a man who had remembered who he was, the look of a man who had stopped grieving and started thinking. Mr. Crane said, "Ezra." He stepped forward. His voice was easy and conversational, the voice of a man who used to wear a deputy's star and had not entirely forgotten how. "Before this lady gets on the back of any saddle, perhaps you would do me the kindness of producing the warrant you mentioned." "The warrant." Crane's face moved. Not much. Just a flicker. Just the small, involuntary shift of a man who had not expected a question. "The warrant is at the marshal's office," and Helena Crane said. "That is interesting," said Ezra, "because the United States Marshal who serves this territory keeps a close ear to what passes through Helena, and the man who used to be sheriff of Cheyenne when I wore a deputy star, a man named Nathan Hawkins, sits now as a deputy marshal in this very district, and he writes me a letter about every 6 weeks because his wife is my second cousin. He has not mentioned any warrant for an Adelaide Whitcomb of Boston, nor has any judge in Helena." Crane's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I will tell you what I think is in that code of yours," Mr. Crane said, "Ezra. I think it is a folded piece of paper with no signature on it. I think it is a forgery, and I think you knew it was a forgery when you rode up here. And I think a court down in Helena would have something to say about a man who rides up onto a homesteader's land with 2 hired guns and a forged warrant looking to take a woman by force on a story he has made up. I think that man would do 12 to 15 years in the territorial penitentiary at Deer Lodge. I think he would do it on my word, because Nathan Hawkins will take my word over yours every day of the week and twice on Sunday." Crane went the color of dirty paper. Texas Bill Hardin laughed. It was a short, surprised sound. He turned his horse a quarter turn and he looked at Crane with new eyes. "Jed," said Texas Bill, "tell me he is lying." Crane did not say anything. Texas Bill spat into the snow. "Frank," he said without turning his head, "I do not work for free, and I do not work for a man who lies to me about what he is paying me to do, and I do not work for a man fool enough to bring 2 professionals up against 3 men in a fortified house and call it an even bet. I am out. I am out," said Frank Mott. The 2 hired men turned their horses and they walked them slowly back down the trail. They did not look back. Texas Bill spat one more time into the slush as he passed the spot where the trail bent into the timber. Then they were gone. Jedediah Crane sat alone on his bay horse in the middle of the dooryard. His hand was very near the pearl handle of his pistol. He did not draw. He was a coward. He had always been a coward. The 2 hired men had been the only thing standing between him and the truth of himself, and now they were gone, and he was looking down the muzzles of 3 rifles with no help coming, and he knew it. Silas brought the sharps up. He set the bead on the 3rd button of Jedediah Crane's coat. "Get off my horse," he said. Crane got off the horse. He got off slow. He kept both hands well away from his belt. His boots hit the slush. He stood there in the dooryard, smaller, without the height of the saddle, his breath coming fast and shallow. Della walked up to him. He flinched. She did not raise her voice. Mr. Crane, she said, you wrote me a letter that was a lie. You took my passage money under a false name. You hid a watch in my trunk. You tried to take what was not given. You rode 3 weeks across this territory with 2 killers to take it again. You are going to ride down to Helena alone, and you are going to walk into Marshal Nathan Hawkins' office, and you are going to put yourself on his desk. You are going to confess to fraud, to false arrest, to attempted abduction, and to anything else my husband to be wishes to charge you with. You are going to do all of this because the alternative is that my husband to be is going to put the Sharps rifle that is currently aimed at your chest through your chest, and I will not lift one finger to stop him. Do we understand each other? Crane nodded. He had no words. Walk, said Silas. Crane walked. He led his horse by the rein. He went down the trail at a pace that was not quite a run, because the rifle behind him would not allow a run. The 3 brothers stood in the dooryard and watched him until his hat disappeared into the timber. Then they watched a long time after that. They listened. They did not hear the sound of a horse turning back. They did not hear the sound of a shot. They heard after a while the receding crunch of his boots in the slush, and then nothing, and then the meadowlark again from the bottom of the meadow. Silas Hollister lowered the Sharps. He turned to Della. His face was wet. Do not ever, he said, do not ever say a thing like you said to me in this yard, Della Whitcomb. Do not ever offer yourself up like that. Do you hear me? Not for me, not for Ezra, not for Wyatt, not for any one of us. Do you hear me? I hear you, she said. He pulled her into him. He held her so tight she could feel the buttons of his coat through the wool of her shawl. He was shaking. He was shaking the way a man shakes when he has come down off a cliff and only realized afterward how close the edge had been. She put her arms around him and she held on and she said nothing and she let him shake. Behind them, Ezra walked over and quietly picked up the pistol off the chopping block. Wyatt, more quietly than anyone had ever seen him do anything, walked up to Silas's other side and put a hand on his older brother's shoulder. It was Wyatt who finally said it. Big brother, he said, I think you better marry that girl before something else tries to take her. Silas laughed. It was a wet sound. It was, Della thought, the first laugh she had ever heard him make. The wedding was on the 18th of April on the bench above the spring pool on the place Silas had taken her the morning of the meadowlark. There had been some discussion of doing it in Helena where there was a proper church with a proper steeple, but Silas had said on the last night of the discussion that he had been married once in a church and that the church had not made it any holier than it would have been on a hilltop. He said he wanted to be married where he had asked her, and Della said yes, and that was the end of the discussion. Cordelia Pike came up from Helena with her 2 children. She had not gone on to Oregon Territory after all. She had stayed in Helena that winter, had taken work as a seamstress, had sent 2 letters up to Della on the mountain by way of the supply rider. She came up the trail on the 15th of April with her boy and her girl walking behind her and a small blue box in her hands that turned out to be the lace collar she had spent 6 weeks making for the wedding dress. She and Della cried for 10 minutes when they saw each other, and neither of them was much good for anything for the rest of the afternoon. Aunt Margaret Whitcomb came up from Vermont. That was the surprise. Cordelia had written to her without telling Della. Aunt Margaret was 64 years old and stout and unsentimental, and she did not approve of frontiers. She had been writing Della letters once a week since November, telling her so. She arrived on the 17th of April on the back of a hired wagon with a trunk and a small carpet bag and a Bible of her own, and when Della saw her, she stopped where she stood in the dooryard and put her hand to her mouth. Aunt Margaret got down off the wagon. She brushed her skirts. She walked over to Della with a face like a thunderhead, and she said, Child, I have come 3,000 miles to a mountain I never wanted to see in order to give you away properly, since your father cannot. Do not waste it. Della burst into tears and threw her arms around her aunt. Aunt Margaret stood very still for a moment, and then she patted Della's back with the careful hand of a woman who had not been embraced in a great many years, and she said, their child, there. The Reverend Thaddeus McAllister rode up from his circuit on the 18th, riding the same swayback gray gelding he had ridden for 9 years. He brought a Bible and a stole and a look of mild bewilderment at having been asked to perform a wedding at the top of a mountain when there was a perfectly good chapel down in Helena. He drank 2 cups of Della's coffee and stopped complaining. There were 47 people at the wedding. Della was astonished. She had not known that 47 people knew the name Hollister. They came from up and down the valley, from Helena, from Pinewood, from a half dozen homesteads no one had ever told her about. They came because Wyatt had ridden to every one of them and told them his oldest brother was getting married after 5 years of mourning, and they were either going to come and stand witness or they were going to answer to him. Wyatt had had been very persuasive. Della stood at the foot of the bench in a borrowed dress of cream linen with Cordelia's lace at the throat and Aunt Margaret's pearl pin in her hair, and she walked up the gentle slope on Aunt Margaret's arm with the wind moving in the new green of the aspens and the meadowlarks calling from every direction, and she came to where Silas was standing in his Sunday suit beside the Reverend McAllister and Silas Hollister, who had not spoken aloud to a woman, not his wife, in 5 years, said her name once before the Reverend even had a chance to begin. Della. She said his name back. They held hands through the whole of the service. The Reverend McAllister read the words from the Book of Common Prayer that have been read at frontier weddings for 200 years. Silas spoke his vows clearly. He did not break. He looked her in the eye, and he promised in the sight of God and the assembled company that he would love her and keep her in sickness and in health, in plenty and in want, until death itself parted them. Della spoke her vows back to him in a voice that did not shake. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Silas pulled out a small folded square of paper from the inside pocket of his coat. He opened it. It was a page from his small leather notebook. He had written something on it that morning before sunrise. He held it where she could see. A Hollister man keeps his word. She laughed and she cried, and she took the paper from him and she folded it and she tucked it inside her bodice over her heart, and he kissed her, and the 47 witnesses on the slope cheered and threw handfuls of wildflowers into the air, and Wyatt Hollister fired 3 shots from his Colt into the high blue Montana sky, and the meadowlarks called from the bottom of the meadow. There was a celebration in the dooryard that ran until well after dark. Aunt Margaret danced once with the Reverend McAllister. Cordelia Pike's children fell asleep in the grass under a borrowed quilt. Wyatt Hollister got into a long argument with a homesteader from over the ridge about the proper way to skin a beaver, and then they shook hands and parted friends. Ezra played the harmonica until his lips gave out, and then Cordelia Pike, who had been a church organist before she was a widow, sat down at the small parlor melodeon Silas had ordered up from Helena as a wedding gift to his bride, and she played hymns until midnight. When the last of the guests had bedded down in the barn or in tents pitched across the dooryard or in the wagon they had driven up, and Silas Hollister carried his bride across the threshold of the cabin he had built with his own hands 12 years before, and he closed the door against the spring wind, and the kerosene lamp burned low in the front room and went out at last on its own. And the next morning the world was new, and Della Hollister came out of her husband's house at sunrise to feed the chickens with her shawl around her shoulders, and the meadowlark called once from the bottom of the meadow. In the long winter that had begun the day, a man fell into a creek, and a woman walked up out of the snow, was at last finally fully ended. The years that followed went the way years go, in a house where the work is honest and the love is quiet. Tobias Joseph Hollister was born on a summer night in 1881 in the same bed where his mother had once held his father through a fever, and the doctor who rode up from Pinewood said he had never seen a man cry the way Silas Hollister cried when he held his son for the first time, the great calloused hands of him cradling the small head, the storm gray eyes of him gone wet and quiet. Eleanor May Hollister came in 1885. Della had asked Silas the night they decided on the name whether it was the right thing to name a daughter after a woman buried behind the house, and Silas had been quiet a long time. And then he had said, "I think she would like it, Della. I think she would think we did not forget." And so the second child was Eleanor May, and she had her mother's blue eyes and her father's slow, careful smile, and she would grow up to be a school teacher in Pinewood and to send her mother letters every Sunday for 34 years. There were 3 more after Eleanor. Casper in 1888, Tessa in 1891, Maeve in 1894, 5 children in all, and the cabin grew with them. Silas added a wing in 1883 and a second story in 1886 and a wide front porch that ran the whole length of the house in 1890. Ezra Hollister married Cordelia Pike in the summer of 1883, months after his older brother's wedding. They moved down to Pinewood, where Ezra took the badge again, this time as the town's first sheriff. Cordelia kept her 2 children from her first marriage, and she and Ezra had 3 more together, and the Pinewood jail almost never had a man in it because the town knew better than to give a Hollister cause to lock the door. Wyatt Hollister rode out of the mountains in the autumn of 1880 and went down to Cheyenne and enrolled in a small law school that took men of his rough background only on the personal recommendation of a serving lawman, and Nathan Hawkins wrote that recommendation, and Wyatt graduated in 3 years instead of 4 because he stayed up reading by lamplight every night. He hung his shingle in Cheyenne in 1884 and married a quiet woman named Sarah Beaumont in 1886, and he became, against the prediction of every man who had ever known him as a young hothead, one of the finest defense attorneys in the territory of Wyoming. He came up to the cabin every summer for 2 weeks. He brought his children. He tried every visit to teach Tobias and Casper to throw a Bowie knife. Della made him stop after the third summer. There were hard years, too. The winter of 1887 took half the cattle. The summer of 1893 brought a wildfire that came within a quarter mile of the cabin before the wind shifted. Boone the bird dog died in 1890, and Silas dug his grave next to Eleanor's stone, and Della and the children put a small wooden cross over it, and Della read out of the prayer book the same words her father had read over her mother's coffin in 1873. Aunt Margaret Whitcomb came west to live with them in 1888. She had outlasted 3 husbands and 2 siblings in Vermont, and she said she had run out of company. She lived in the wing Silas had built in 1883, and she taught the Hollister children to read out of the same primer she had taught Della from in 1862, and she died peacefully in 1897 at the age of 81, and she was buried in the picket-fenced plot behind the cabin beside Eleanor and Boone with a stone Silas carved by hand. Della went down behind the cabin every first day of the month, the way her husband had done before her. She brought a single dried alpine flower to Eleanor's stone and to Aunt Margaret's and a small biscuit to Boone's. Silas walked with her when his knees would still let him and stood beside her and held her hand and did not speak. It was a good life. It was a long life. It was the life that had begun on a December morning in 1879 when a girl who had answered a letter from a man who did not exist whispered the wrong name into a stranger's coat, and the stranger carried her home anyway. In the autumn of 1909, on a Sunday afternoon, 30 years almost to the day from the day Silas Hollister had carried Adelaide Whitcomb up off the snow at Eagles Point, the family gathered at the cabin for the kind of Sunday they had been gathering for since the children were small. Silas was 70 years old. His hair was white. His shoulders were still broad, but they had dropped half an inch with the years. His beard had gone the color of old snow. He walked with a cane carved by Wyatt, who had a way with a knife. Even after 30 years in a courtroom, he still went down behind the cabin on the first day of the month. He still split his own kindling when Della would let him, which was not often anymore. Della was 53. Her honey hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and her hands were the hands of a frontier woman, and her blue eyes were the same eyes that had looked up at her husband from the snow. She wore a soft gray dress and a shawl Cordelia had crocheted for her, and the cameo brooch with her grandmother's name on it, which she had worn at her throat every day of her life since November of 1879. The children had come up. Tobias was a doctor in Helena, a tall man of 28 with his mother's blue eyes and his father's quiet way. He had brought his wife Lillian and their 2 small children. Eleanor May had come from Pinewood with her husband, a schoolmaster named Caleb Wright, and their 3 children. Casper was 21 and ran the ranch now. Tessa was 18 and engaged to be married in the spring. Maeve was 15 and would not stop reading, even at the dinner table, until her mother took the book out of her hands. Ezra and Cordelia came up from Pinewood. Ezra was 66. He had finally retired from the badge that spring, and he carved birds out of cedar all day the way he had done in 1879, only now there were grandchildren who brought them home as treasures. Wyatt came up from Cheyenne with Sarah and his 4 grown children and 2 grandchildren of his own. Wyatt was 62. The auburn of his hair had gone iron gray. He had argued cases before the Wyoming Supreme Court the year before. He still wore a Bowie knife on his hip when he was on the mountain. He claimed he wore it for cutting cheese. No one believed him. The dooryard that Sunday afternoon was full of running children. Tobias's little girl, Della May, who was 6 and bore her grandmother's name, ran up onto the porch with a handful of edelweiss she had picked from the slope above the house, and she climbed up onto her grandfather's lap. "Grandpa," she said. "Grandpa, tell me again about when Grandma came up the mountain." Silas shifted her on his knee. He looked across the porch at Della. Della was knitting in her chair beside him. She did not look up, but she was smiling. "Della," he said to the small girl on his knee, "your grandmother came up that trail in November of 79, the worst storm of that year. She had been put off a wagon train 4 days south of here for a thing she did not do. She walked north because a kind woman had told her to walk north. She got to Eagles Point with the last of her strength, and the wolves came out of the timber, and your great-uncle Wyatt put a sharp's round on the lead one at 300 yards, and your great-uncle Ezra and I went down and brought her up to the cabin. I had sworn at your great-aunt Eleanor's grave 5 years before that I would never carry another woman through that snow. I had sworn I would not love again. I had sworn I would die alone and be buried beside her, and that would be the end of me." He looked at his wife. She was still not looking up. She was still smiling. "I was a fool," he said. The child on his knee laughed. "Why were you a fool, Grandpa?" "Because," he said, "the mountain had made up its mind, and a man does not argue with a mountain." The mountain chose her Della May. The mountain chose your grandmother for me. I just took the long way around to admitting it. The little girl considered this. She turned her head and she looked at her grandmother in the next chair. She said, Grandma, did the mountain really choose you? Della finally looked up. She set her knitting in her lap. She looked at the small face beside her and at her husband's hand resting on the small back, and beyond them at the dooryard full of running grandchildren, and at the long meadow falling away to the south, and at the ridge of pine and lodgepole that ran along the horizon to the east, where Eagle's Point was where she had once stood at the edge of a long fall and whispered the name of a woman she had never met. Yes, my love, she said, the mountain chose me. The sun went down behind the western peaks an hour later. The grandchildren came into supper. Aunt Margaret's old place at the table was filled by Eleanor May now. The lamps were lit. Ezra played a hymn on the harmonica before grace. They held hands around the long table, and Silas Hollister said grace in his slow, careful voice, the voice of a man who measured every word because he had been 5 years without them. And the prayer he said was the same prayer he had said every Sunday at that table for 30 years. Lord, he said, we thank you for this house and for the hands that built it and for the people who fill it. We thank you for the work of the year. We thank you for the children at this table and for the children to come. We thank you for those we have loved and lost. Eleanor Ashford, Aunt Margaret, the Reverend Josiah Whitcomb and his wife, we carry them with us. We thank you for the woman beside me who came up out of the snow in the winter of 79 and who has been the breath in this house every day since. Bless this food. Bless the hands that prepared it. Bless the road home for those who must travel it, and bless the night for those who stay. In the name of your Son, amen. Amen, said the table. Later, when the supper was cleared and the children were bedded down and the house had gone quiet for the night, Silas and Della Hollister walked out onto the front porch together. He held her hand. She held his. The moon was up over the ridge and it was nearly full, and the meadow below the cabin was silver with it. Do you remember, he said, the first morning we stood out here together, the morning of the meadowlark? I remember, she said. Do you remember what I said? You said the mountain chose me. You said I was home. I meant it. Then he said, I mean it now. You were home from the moment my brother handed me that spyglass. She laid her head against his shoulder. They were standing the way they had stood in the hollow above the spring pool 30 years before. Only the wind was warmer now, and the world was not new, but old and well-worn. Silas Hollister, she said, are you sorry for any part of it? He thought about that a long time. He always thought a long time about a question. He had not been a man in a hurry with words in 30 years. I am sorry for one thing, he said. I swore an oath at a grave 5 years before you came up that trail. 5 years I cost myself. 5 years I sat in this house and cut myself off from the world. If the Lord ever asks me what I did with those 5 years, I will not have a good answer for him. That is my one regret, that I could not have found you sooner. She lifted her head. She looked up at him. But if you had found me sooner, she said, you would not have been the man you are. I would not have been the woman I am. Everything came at the time it was meant to come. My father told me that on the last morning of his life. I did not understand it then. I do not always understand it now, but I have lived long enough to believe it. He looked down at her. The storm in his eyes had been quiet for 30 years. It would not come back. You are home, he said. You have always been home. This mountain chose you, and I am the most thankful man on it. He kissed her slowly, the way a man kisses a wife of 30 years on a porch in the moonlight. The wind moved in the pines below the cabin. Somewhere down toward Eagle's Point, a single coyote sang one long note across the night, and was answered far off by another, and the silence came back down over the ridge like a clean white sheet. Inside the cabin, the lamps burned low and went out one by one. Outside in the picket-fenced plot behind the house, the wind moved gently across the carved stones of Eleanor Ashford Hollister and Aunt Margaret Whitcomb and Boone, the dog, and a single dried alpine flower lay at the foot of the first of those stones where Della Hollister had laid it that morning, the way she had laid one there every first day of the month for 30 years. She still remembered the leather of her boots gone hard as iron. She still remembered the wind that screamed instead of howled. She still remembered the wolves singing in the timber and the sound of the rifle from somewhere up the slope and the arms that had lifted her like the bough of an oak tree and the face above her in the gray light and the name she had whispered without knowing why. 30 years later, standing on the porch, her husband had built with his own hands, watching her grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers in the moonlight, she thought. That was the day my life began. The mountain chose me, and I did not have the wisdom to argue with the mountain. And the wind moved in the pines on Blackwood Ridge, and the moon went its way across the high, cold sky over Montana, and the long road that had begun in a row house in Boston in October of 1879 had come at last all the way home.